What if one moment on the street reminded you of the child you lost forever? This is the heartbreaking story of a millionaire, his girlfriend, and a homeless boy who carried a face from the past. Stay with us until the end. You won't believe what happened next. And before we begin, if you love stories of kindness and second chances, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to The Kind World for more heart-touching tales. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that carried the sound of footsteps against the pavement. A millionaire and his girlfriend were strolling back from dinner, their conversation soft and unhurried, until suddenly she stopped mid-step. Her eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat, and she grabbed his arm with trembling fingers. "He looks like your son who passed away," she whispered, her voice fragile as glass dot. The man followed her gaze. There, just outside a bakery, sat a little homeless boy. His clothes were torn, his hair unkempt, his tiny body shivering in the chill of the evening. But it wasn't his condition that struck them. It was his face, his eyes, his timid smile, the way he hugged himself against the cold. The boy's resemblance to the millionaire's late child was uncanny, almost cruel. For a moment, the man felt as though time had folded, and his son was sitting before him once again. His chest tightened, and a flood of emotions he had locked away for years suddenly surged back with unbearable force. He had lost his son in a tragic accident years ago, a wound that had never truly healed. To cope, he buried himself in wealth, business, and silence, hiding his broken heart behind the walls of success. But now, this fragile boy with hauntingly familiar eyes had ripped those walls down in an instant. The millionaire tried to steady himself, but the weight of memory pressed hard against his heart. He blinked rapidly, hoping to push back the tears that threatened to fall, yet his body betrayed him. His eyes watered, his hands shook. The boy looked up at him, unaware of the storm raging in the man's chest. In the softest, most desperate voice, he whispered, "Sir, do you have some food?" That simple question broke the last piece of the man's resistance. A request so small, yet filled with all the pain of hunger and loneliness. The millionaire's girlfriend knelt beside the child, pulling off her shawl to wrap around his frail shoulders. She stroked his hair gently, whispering words of comfort, while the man remained frozen, staring at the boy as though looking into the eyes of his lost child. For years, he had refused to let himself feel, afraid that opening his heart would only deepen his grief. But now he realized that sometimes the heart doesn't ask for permission. It simply recognizes what it needs. And at that moment he needed to protect this boy, to save him from the cruelty of the streets, perhaps to heal his own brokenness in the process. Finally, with a shaky breath, he stepped closer, lowered himself to his knees, and placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. His voice cracked as he said, "Come with me. Tonight, you won't sleep hungry." The boy's wide, cautious eyes searched his face, as though trying to believe him, as though hope was too heavy a burden to carry. But then, a faint smile appeared on his lips, small and fragile, like the flicker of a candle in the darkness. That night was the beginning of something neither the millionaire nor the boy could have predicted. What started as a moment of compassion turned into days and then weeks of transformation. The boy was given food, clean clothes, and a warm bed. But beyond the physical comforts, he was given something he had never known before: love, safety, and belonging. And for the millionaire, the boy became a source of healing. He laughed again, for the first time in years. He smiled at little things. The silence in his home, once unbearable, was now filled with footsteps and laughter. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, the millionaire's girlfriend leaned in and whispered softly, "Maybe God sent him, not to replace your son, but to mend your broken heart." Her words sank deep, and he realized she was right. Life had taken his son away, but perhaps life had also brought this boy as a second chance, not to erase the past, but to give meaning to the future. The true moment of transformation came when the millionaire looked into the boy's eyes one evening and asked, "Would you like to stay with us? Forever?" The boy's face crumpled with tears as he threw his arms around the man's neck. "I never had a dad before," he whispered, sobbing into his shoulder. The millionaire closed his eyes, holding him tightly, as though protecting both the child and the fragile piece of his own heart that had finally begun to heal. In that embrace, a broken man found wholeness again, and a forgotten child found the love of a family. Life, in its mysterious way, had stitched two wounded souls together. And in that moment, both knew they would never again be alone. Here's an expanded, flowing 700-word version of Scene 2. The memory flood for you, written like a storytelling script without headings or boxes. The millionaire's heart clenched as if invisible hands had reached into his chest and twisted. For years, he had lived with the shadow of a memory that haunted him at every turn. His son, his pride, his joy, had been taken from him in a tragic accident that no amount of wealth or influence could prevent. It was the one battle he couldn't win, the one wound money couldn't heal. After that day, he had chosen to lock his grief away, burying it beneath endless hours of business, investments, and luxury. Outwardly, he had everything. Inwardly, he was a man with a broken soul, drifting through life without purpose. But now, staring at this fragile boy with thin arms and hollow eyes, his world cracked wide open. The resemblance was terrifying. The shape of his eyes, the way his lips curled faintly when he tried to smile. It was like staring into a mirror of the past. His chest tightened until breathing felt impossible. He wanted to look away, to retreat behind the fortress he had built over the years. But something anchored him in place. The boy, unaware of the storm raging inside the man, lifted his head. His voice, weak and trembling, carried more weight than the richest words ever could. "Sir, do you have some food?" The plea was simple, yet it tore through the millionaire's defenses like a blade. That single sentence carried all the pain of a child who had been unseen, unfed, unloved. And suddenly the walls around the man's heart began to crumble. In that moment, he no longer saw a stranger's child. He saw his own son, hungry, scared, reaching out to him for help. The memory of his boy's laughter, his small hand gripping his own, came flooding back with such force that tears welled up unbidden in his eyes. He turned slightly, as if to hide the emotion burning across his face, but his girlfriend noticed. She had always known his grief, but she had never seen it surface with such rawness. Her hand gently touched his arm, grounding him in the present. Yet she, too, couldn't take her eyes off the boy. Something about him was different, something that tugged at the soul and refused to let go. The millionaire's mind screamed for him to move, to say something, to walk away before the pain consumed him. But his heart, long silent, whispered something else. This child, though not his son, was still someone's son. A boy left to shiver in the cold, begging strangers for scraps of kindness. Could he really walk away, knowing that his fortune could buy banquets while this child starved? His lips parted, but no words came out. For years he had negotiated deals worth millions, yet now he found himself speechless before a single hungry child. The boy's eyes didn't carry bitterness. They carried hope. Hope that maybe this man, this stranger in fine clothes, might spare him a little bread. And it was that hope that broke him. The millionaire's chest rose and fell unevenly as he struggled to contain himself. His throat tightened, his vision blurred with tears he could no longer fight back. For so long he had believed that opening his heart again would only bring more pain. But watching the boy tremble before him, he realized something profound. The pain was already there. The difference now was the chance to do something with it, to transform it into compassion instead of silence. The girlfriend knelt down beside the boy, wrapping her shawl around his shoulders to shield him from the chill. The child flinched at first, unaccustomed to gentle hands, then slowly leaned into her warmth. She whispered softly, "You're safe, little one," though her voice cracked under the weight of her own emotions. The millionaire finally lowered himself to the boy's level, knees touching the cold ground. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly feel, to look into the eyes of a child and let the memory of his son wash over him, not as a torment, but as a reminder. His son had been taken, yes, but here before him was another boy, who still had a chance. The boy's voice echoed again in his mind. "Do you have some food?" The words weren't just a request. They were a call to awaken, to live again. And as the millionaire reached out his hand toward the child, he knew something inside him had shifted forever. Here's a 700-word expanded version of Scene 3, The Choice, written in the same emotional, cinematic style as before. The boy shivered violently, his frail body barely able to withstand the night's chill. The girlfriend's heart ached as she gently unwrapped her shawl and draped it over his narrow shoulders. Her fingers lingered for a moment, brushing against the child's thin arms. The fabric was warm, soft, comforting, and though the boy flinched at first, as though kindness was something foreign, something he was unaccustomed to, he slowly relaxed into the embrace of warmth. His wide eyes looked up at her, silently, questioning why a stranger would care. The millionaire stood just behind them, frozen in place. His body was rigid, his mind torn in two directions. One part of him screamed to step back, to retreat, to close the wound that had been ripped open the moment he saw the boy's face. He had spent years building a fortress around his grief, convincing himself that burying the pain was the only way to survive. And yet, here he was, face to face with a child who looked hauntingly like the son he had lost. The resemblance was unbearable, but so too was the thought of walking away. His heart thudded heavily in his chest. He remembered the long nights after the accident, when silence filled his home like a suffocating fog. He remembered staring at empty chairs at the dinner table, at toys that no longer moved, at photographs that only deepened the ache in his soul. That ache had shaped him, hardened him, and made him hide behind money, luxury, and control. But now, for the first time, he was realizing that money couldn't buy what his heart was yearning for in this moment. The chance to save a child who had no one. He looked down at the boy. The child's lips trembled, not just from the cold, but from the uncertainty of whether anyone would ever care. His eyes, though weary, held a flicker of something fragile yet powerful. Hope. It was that glimmer of hope that struck the millionaire hardest of all. This boy had not yet given up. He still believed someone might help him. The girlfriend glanced back at the millionaire, her gaze firm but pleading. "We can't just leave him here," her eyes seemed to say. She didn't speak aloud, but the look was enough. She knew him. She knew the storm raging inside his heart. She also knew he couldn't live with himself if he chose to walk away. The millionaire's breath caught in his throat. He lowered his eyes, fighting against the flood of memories, the fear of reopening wounds that had never truly closed. But then a thought broke through. Maybe this wasn't about reopening wounds. Maybe it was about healing them. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he stepped forward. His polished shoes echoed against the pavement as he moved closer to the boy. He knelt down, bringing himself level with the child. For a moment, he just stared, his vision blurred with unshed tears. Then, with a voice heavy with both sorrow and compassion, he whispered, "Come with me. Tonight, you won't sleep hungry." The words hung in the air like a promise. The boy blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. His lips parted slightly, his small chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. He had asked strangers for food before, but most turned away. Some ignored him, and others scolded him for begging. This was different. This man wasn't offering coins or scraps. He was offering safety, warmth, and the chance to belong. The boy's eyes glistened as he searched the man's face for any hint of insincerity. But what he saw instead was a broken heart reaching out to mend itself through him. Slowly, cautiously, the boy gave a faint nod. It was small, but it was enough. The girlfriend's eyes filled with tears as she placed her hand on the millionaire's shoulder. She whispered softly, "You did the right thing." But he didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat was too tight, his emotions too raw. He simply reached for the boy's hand. The tiny fingers, rough and cold from nights on the street, slipped into his palm. They were fragile, yet their touch was powerful enough to break years of silence inside the millionaire's soul. He closed his hand around the boy's, feeling the weight of the choice he had just made. It wasn't just a choice to feed him for the night. It was the choice to let love back into his life, to take the risk of feeling again, to let this child remind him that his heart was still alive. As they stood together, the boy leaning into him timidly, the millionaire realized something profound. Love doesn't always return in the way we expect. Sometimes it comes back in the form of a second chance, wrapped in the fragile body of a child who only wanted a meal, but ended up bringing healing instead. That night, for the first time in years, the millionaire didn't feel empty. He felt human. And as he led the boy away from the cold streets, his heart whispered the truth he had been afraid to believe. Maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where sorrow could finally give way to hope. Here's an expanded, 700-word version of Scene 4, The Transformation, written in the same heartfelt cinematic flow as before. Days slipped quietly into weeks, and what had begun as a single act of compassion slowly unfolded into something far greater. The boy, once shivering and fragile on the cold pavement, now had warmth in his cheeks and light in his eyes. Each morning he woke up in a soft bed instead of on hard concrete. He ate meals that filled his stomach and clothes that protected him from the biting wind. The street child who had once begged for scraps was now treated with dignity, and in return, he blossomed like a flower finally given sunlight. But what surprised everyone most was not the boy's transformation. It was the millionaire's. The man who had once lived behind a fortress of silence and sorrow began to smile again. At first, the changes were small. A quiet chuckle when the boy told a clumsy joke, a softer tone in his voice when he asked the child about his day. But soon, the laughter grew louder, the smiles more frequent, and his once heavy steps carried a lightness that no one had seen in him since the accident that had taken his son. The mansion, which had long felt more like a museum than a home, began to echo with new sounds, footsteps running down the hallways, bursts of laughter over simple meals, the gentle murmur of bedtime stories read aloud in voices that carried love instead of grief. The dining table, once marked by an empty chair that only deepened the void in the millionaire's heart, now felt whole again. The boy sat in that chair, not as a replacement, but as a reminder that life, despite its cruel losses, still offered second chances. The girlfriend noticed the change most of all. She had stood beside the millionaire through years of silence, watching him drown in his sorrow, powerless to pull him back. She had seen him stare at photo frames with empty eyes, seen him retreat into his work just to escape the weight of his grief. But now she saw something different, something miraculous. His eyes no longer carried only pain, they carried purpose. When he looked at the boy, she saw hope flicker in his gaze, as if he had found a reason to live again. One evening, as the three of them sat together in the living room, the boy on the floor playing with a toy car, the girlfriend leaned closer to the millionaire. Her voice was soft, almost reverent, as though she feared breaking the fragile beauty of the moment. Maybe God sent him, not to replace your son, but to heal you. The words struck him deeply. For years he had believed his pain was a punishment, a wound that would never mend. But now, as he watched the boy's small hands push the toy across the carpet, he wondered if perhaps she was right. Maybe life hadn't abandoned him after all. Maybe this child had been placed in his path not to erase the memory of his son, but to remind him that love could still be found, even in the unlikeliest of places. He thought about the boy's laughter, the way it rang through the halls like music. He thought about the way the boy had taken his hand when they first met, small fingers gripping tightly as though trusting him completely from the very beginning. And he realized something. This child was healing wounds he didn't even know were still bleeding. In quiet moments, the millionaire would catch himself remembering his own son, not with the same crippling sorrow, but with gratitude for the time they had shared. The pain was still there, yes, but it no longer consumed him. The boy had shown him that opening his heart again didn't mean betraying the memory of his child. It meant honoring it by continuing to give love where it was needed most. The staff in the house began to notice too. They whispered to one another about how the master of the house now carried himself differently, how the gloom that once hung over the mansion had lifted. They watched him sit at the table with the boy, sometimes leaning down to help him cut his food, sometimes bursting into laughter at something silly. They saw him walk through the garden with the boy on his shoulders, pointing out stars and telling stories. It was as if the man who had been lost for so long had finally found his way home. And the boy, who had once known nothing but loneliness, began to glow under this new love. He spoke more, laughed more, and his eyes no longer darted with fear when someone approached. In the safety of this newfound family, he discovered what it meant to belong. The millionaire, once convinced he would spend the rest of his days in silence, realized that he was living again, and in his heart he silently thanked God for sending this boy, not to erase the past, but to give him a future worth holding on to. The evening was quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness that made the world feel softer. Warm light spilled from the chandelier above the dining table, casting a golden glow across the room. The boy sat there, small hands folded over the plate in front of him, his eyes fixed on the man he now looked to with awe and trust. He had eaten well, he had laughed that day, but there was still a lingering question hidden in his gaze, the question of whether this love, this safety was only temporary. The millionaire watched him closely, sensing the unspoken fear behind the boy's hopeful eyes. He had seen it before, in the way the child sometimes hesitated to laugh too loudly, or the way he clung to every promise as though it might vanish if he blinked. The boy had learned not to expect permanence. For children who grow up on the streets, kindness often came like passing clouds, here for a moment, then gone, leaving the sky just as gray as before. The man's chest tightened. For weeks he had cared for this child, and in that time his own broken heart had slowly been stitched back together. But now he realized the boy didn't just need food or warmth. He needed belonging. He needed to know that the arms holding him would not let go. Taking a slow breath, the millionaire leaned forward, his voice gentle but steady. "Would you like to stay with us? Forever?" For a moment, silence filled the room. The boy blinked, his small shoulders trembling as though he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. His lips quivered, and then the tears came, hot, unstoppable, overflowing with years of longing. He slid off his chair and rushed into the man's arms, hugging him tightly, burying his face in his chest. Through sobs, he whispered words that broke and healed all at once. "I never had a dad before." The millionaire's arms wrapped firmly around the boy, holding him as though he were cradling not just a child, but a miracle. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years his tears were not just of sorrow, but of gratitude. Gratitude that life, after so much loss, had given him another chance to love. The girlfriend watched, her own tears streaming freely. She knew how long the man had carried his grief like a chain around his soul. And now, in this single moment, she saw the chain shatter. She stepped closer, laying a hand on both of them, as if to complete the circle of love that was being born in that room. From that night forward, things were different. The boy no longer looked at the door with the fear of being sent away. He began to laugh freely, knowing that this laughter would echo in a home that was truly his. He began to sleep deeply, without the gnawing hunger or the fear of the cold night air. And the millionaire, once a man broken by the loss of his son, began to live each day with a heart full of purpose. He had lost, yes, but he had also found. Neighbors and friends began to notice the change. They saw the man who once walked with his head low, now smiling with a boy at his side. They heard stories of how the child had enrolled in school, how he ran into the man's arms after every lesson, how the two of them seemed inseparable. The community whispered of transformation, of a heart once shattered now whole again, all because a moment of kindness had blossomed into something eternal. The millionaire no longer saw the boy as just a reminder of the son he had lost. He saw him as himself once again, a father, a protector, a man capable of giving love. And the boy no longer saw himself as just a homeless child. He was now a son, a part of a family, a soul who had finally found where he belonged. The girlfriend's words from weeks before echoed in the man's mind. Maybe God sent him, not to replace your son, but to heal you. And now, holding the boy in his arms, he finally understood the truth in those words. Healing had come, not through forgetting, but through loving again. Sometimes life takes away, but sometimes it gives back in ways we could never imagine. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to The Kind World, where kindness lives forever. And as the screen faded to black, the image of the man and the boy, bound together by love and second chances, lingered like a promise that even in the darkest chapters of life, light can return when we dare to open our hearts.